Welcome everyone to Dorsey and Whitney's webinar on preparing your annual report under the SEC's new mining rules. I'd like to introduce Kimberley Anderson, a partner in Dorsey's corporate governance and compliance group. Kimberley?
Hi, it is very, very nice to be able to chat with you today about this. Thank you very much for joining us, and we appreciate you spending your time. So why don't we jump in? Very quick, some housekeeping methods. Some housekeeping matters. So today's program is an hour. You can get additional materials and attendance forms as noted on the emails. And then if you have any questions, please submit them using chat. We will try to answer them, time permitting. I'm not sure why I say we, because it's just me. But I'll try to get your questions, time permitting. And I will try not to make this mind-numbingly awful. So let's jump in. So we're going to do a quick, very, very brief overview of the background, which you're probably aware of, but we want to highlight a couple of things. And then we'll go into kind of what the new rules are, where they are, et cetera. And then we're going to jump into disclosure. And then, time permitting, we may go into some of the situations we've been discussing with the SEC with respect to some disclosure issues or questions. We'll try to bring those up during the course of the presentation as well. But again, we can get started. All right, so Industry Guide 7, which is, we're going to assume for purposes of today's conversation that we're dealing with an issuer who has a December 31 fiscal year end. And so, which means that while technically speaking, the issuer has been subject to the new rules for this entire year, this 10K, assuming other things that have not occurred, the 10K that's being filed in March will be the first that actually contains the new disclosure. So last year's 10K was under Industry Guide 7. That had been around for a long time, since 1982. It only recognized reserves. It didn't recognize resources. And, but it did have some advantages, let's be clear. It was a little easier to deal with in some ways. It was less technical. You could really sit down and read it in a matter of probably 2 minutes. There was no requirement for qualified person review. You didn't have to publish technical reports. And if you were a Canadian filer subject to NI 43-101, you were allowed to include your foreign disclosures in your SEC registration statements, even though, and your reports and so on, even though they didn't comply with Industry Guide 7. For example, you could report resources, whereas a domestic company could not. So that was one of the concerns, is that it placed significant disclosure limitations on issuers. It was out of date. It placed US issuers at a disadvantage. It moved a lot of very relevant disclosure over to press releases, websites, et cetera. So it had its issues. So they put in the new SEC mining rules. They're primarily located in subpart 1300 to Reg SK, based on the Crisco standards. So it is, the purpose of it, it really was intended to sort of speak the same language. It is not identical, however. We are not going to go through the various differences because we are assuming that you have a 1300 technical report, or you've done your reviews under 1300 in preparation for your 10K. So we're not going to be focusing on the differences or what you have to do to prepare a technical report summary. So this is going to be effective for your first fiscal year, beginning on or after January 1, 2021. And so, but here's the issue. If you are a Canadian issuer and you were used to being able to include your 43-101 information, you can't do that anymore. You're no longer allowed to present 43-101 information unless it's also compliant with SEC rules. So with the new 1300 rules. So before you kind of had a pass to put in all of that information. Now you can't include information that's inconsistent with 1300. All right, so who is subject to it? Pretty much every reporting issuer, except those who are what are called MJDS filers, the multi-jurisdictional disclosure system. Essentially, Canadian issuers of a certain size and trading history, et cetera. And they would report under what are called like Form 40F. So in other words, it's really a wrap around your Canadian disclosure. If you're not sure if you're an MJDS filer, then you should assume that you're not. All right. So let's say you're a private company or otherwise. Should you care about the disclosure? Should you care about the new rules? Well, you may if you decide you want to list in the United States, because then you will be subject to them with that registration statement. If you lose your MJDS or foreign private issuer status, and so you have to move on to the US forms. Or you do other types of registration statements that are not on MJDS, in other words, that are not exempt from the new rules. But today we're really going to focus on a Form 10K. So let's see. Now, let's just move on. So really what fundamentally comes down to the types of disclosure that will be included will be your filed reports, your 10Ks, 20Fs, Qs, Ks. Certain things are exempt. For example, earnings releases, a 6K that foreign issuers use unless it's specifically, incorporated into a registration statement. So website disclosures, other types of written or verbal disclosures. Keep in mind, whether or not 1300 applies to any of your disclosure, all of your disclosures are always subject to anti-fraud rules. And remember, Americans have absolutely no sense of humor about things like this. So, you have to make sure that what you say is actually true. All right, so the location of the mining rules are located in primarily two places. So as part of Regulation SK, Item 601 in the exhibits, the technical report summary, the primary description of the technical report summary is actually located in the list of exhibits. Why they put it there as opposed to making a new item under 1300, I have no idea. But nonetheless, that's where it is. But what we're really going to be talking about today is under item 1300. So this is the disclosure by registrants engaged in mining operations. So it's 1300 through 1305. I get that there's only 6 of the rules, but I will note that they are somewhat technical and a little hard to get through. All right, so I want to go through, before we jump into the required disclosure, I want to talk to you about some of the selected terminology we're going to be talking about here. And I'm not going through inferred resources or the reserves versus resources, et cetera. We're not focusing on that so much right now. So you may think my choice is a little unusual when it comes to terminology, but you'll understand as we go through. So exploration stage property. It's a property that has no mineral reserves disclosed. So in other words, if you either don't have a 1300 compliant report that establishes mineral reserves, or either you simply choose not to do it, or for one reason or another, you have resources and not reserves, you are an exploration stage property. You can be in production, you can be extracting ore, and you will still be identified as an exploration stage property. It can be an operating mine, been operating for decades, but if you don't have reserves under 1300, it is exploration stage and it has to be identified that way. So the next one is the development stage property. So you have mineral reserves, but no material extraction. So that one seems to make a bit more sense. And then production is you have both mineral extraction and mineral reserves. So those two seem to make sense. It's based on the exploration stage that is really totally dependent, not on the stage of development of the property, but whether or not reserves exist. Point of reference. Now, the reason I put this in here is that it's not actually defined in the rules. And it was discussed in the proposed rules, not really discussed in the finals, but you are required to include it on the tables. And essentially what this comes down to is at what point in the process are your reserves and resources measured? For many companies, it is in situ, in the ground. For other companies that are, the way they process the minerals, it is actually done at the point of processing. So that is the point of reference they're talking about. It is not a time period, it is a point in, it is really at the location and the point of the mining process that you have to identify. All right, and then the last one that I want to chat briefly about is an exploration target. So an exploration target is, and this is actually their definition. So it's going to be a statement or estimate of an exploration potential of a mineral deposit. But it's where you don't have sufficient exploration to estimate a resource. So if there's areas in your property that you consider to be, as you said, like a significant deposit that you either want to explore or that you consider material and you do want to be able to discuss, you can do that even though you don't actually have a resource. And we'll talk about what you have to say because the SEC is kind of picky on this stuff. All right, so we'll move on. So there's three primary areas for the actual substantive disclosure: summary disclosure, individual property disclosure, and then internal controls. And then there's some other requirements that talk about, when you have to file exhibits, getting consents, and so on. So those are sort of but we're primarily going to be spending time on the summary in the individual property disclosure. Okay, so summary disclosure. This is item 1303. And sorry, this is item 1303. So if you have material mining operations, right, and you have 2 or more mining properties, then you're required to include summary disclosure. If you only have 1 mining property, you can skip this altogether because there's no point in doing a summary because you're going to have to do the individual property disclosure. So this will be required again when you have 2 or more material mining operations. Now, one question you might be asking yourself is, what is considered a material mining operation? At one point, the SEC was considering putting in 10% bright line rules to determine materiality, et cetera. They ultimately decided to go back to really the standard, which is it's a materiality standard based on a reasonable investor. So in other words, you're going to consider the qualitative and quantitative factors in the context of your entire business to determine if you have material mining operations. And so so if you are, for example, a vertically integrated company, but your operations, the mining operations are a very small percentage of the company as a whole, but in terms of percentage of assets and so on, but the remainder of the company is very dependent on the mining operations to be able to supply the rest of the vertically integrated company, then yes, that would be based on qualitative and quantitative standards. That is really going to be a question of materiality. And so that would be material. So really it's a matter of considering the factors as a whole to determine if you have material mining operations, and the same thing as to whether any individual property is material. So royalty companies that don't have access to all of the information that we're going to be discussing that are required, you can omit the information. However, you do have to make some disclosure at the same time, such as you have to indicate what information you don't have access to, that it would be an unreasonable burden or expense to be able to get that information, that you did actually try to request the information from the unaffiliated company who denied the request. So unaffiliated company is kind of important here. So if the royalty is with sort of an affiliated company, the theory is like they are an affiliate, you should be able to get that information from them. And then you also have to provide all required information to the extent that you can get it without incurring, again, the unreasonable burden or expense. So a glossary is allowed for technical terms. Now, the concept of a technical term is that if you can't find it in a conventional dictionary. So, I wouldn't put every possible term or everything else, particularly if it can easily be located. It really is meant for technical terms. And they would like you to use plain English to the extent practicable. Plain English tends to be, first person description, easy to read, bullets, etc. In other words, try to make it as easy as possible for the investor to be able to read and understand this. So in other words, try not to make it too dense. I agree that's easier said than done. All right, so the next is, this is actually what needs to be in the summary disclosure. So the overview, so first it has to cover all of your properties, material and immaterial properties. So you're going to want maps showing the location. It has to be legible. So, and it must be legible when printed. So it really is a good test. So if you're trying to figure out if something's good enough and you can read something when it's blown up really big on your screen, but then when you print it, it's utterly illegible, no, go with the printing. It's actually a good test. So you'll need to provide an overview summary of the properties with details. You can do this in a tabular or narrative format. Figure out based on your company, which one makes the most sense. So you need company-wide 3-year production history. We'll come back to that if you don't have reserves, but you're producing. Location of the properties, ownership interests, who owns it, who operates it. If you own a certain percentage, if it's done through a joint venture, you're not the operator needs to be identified. Titles, if there's leases, what are the material terms in terms of expiration? The stage of the properties, and we're going to come back to that in a second. Any key permit conditions, mine style, is it underground? Is it surface mining? How is it mined? What we're really looking for is a very, brief description. This is not intended to be detailed. What other types of processing plants are available? And so if you also have a material property, so let's say, for example, you've got 3 properties. One is material. So you're going to have the individual property disclosure with respect to that. You can, in this section, include cross-references to avoid duplication of information. So that's, they're trying to help things get streamlined to the extent they can. So above, we talked about the concept of the stages of properties: exploration, development, and production. So let's go back to, and then above there's the question on that 3-year production history. So let's say that you decide that you do not want to bother getting a QP to determine your reserves. Fine. So no problem. You simply have to identify the property as exploration stage. No worries. You can do that. Now, if it happens to be an operating mine, then you are extracting minerals. You can still list it under the company production history. So, the use of the production, as part of that table does not create an issue. However, for properties, if it is an exploration stage property, but it is also operating, the way you should describe it is to indicate that you have commenced extraction of minerals without having determined or without having defined mineral reserves pursuant to SK 1300. So, and that's the word you can use. Extraction, perfectly fine. Operating mine, perfectly fine. Do not use production with respect to that property, or development with respect to that property, or any derivative thereof. So those are kind of hot buttons for the SEC. So we just want to make sure that when you're thinking about how you're describing properties for any place without a reserve, you want to make sure that you don't talk about it being in production or being a producing mine. So that's just something to sort of keep in mind while you're going and doing your drafting. All right, so we're still in the summary. And so we're dealing with separate tables for resources and reserves. So this is the table that was taken out of, this is the sample table in the rules. You can modify the tables for ease of presentation, to provide information, additional information, et cetera. This is the resource table. There's also a sample reserve table. It's very similar, which is why it's not in here. So you will separate it by commodity, geographic region, and then each property that contains 10% of the combined measured and indicated, ignore inferred resources for that measurement, or 10% of the mineral reserves. So that's when you see, so if you see on the list, it shows mine / property A, property B. So that's what you would do for everything that hits that 10% or greater mark. Now, that does not mean that you have to have an individual property disclosure for each that are above 10%. That's just for this table. You have to make sure that you have hit, sort of the separate line item. And then it talks about, the prices used for each commodity, and then that point of reference, which is the one that we discussed before. All right, so some of this is repetitive of what we just discussed, but all resources must be disclosed exclusive of reserves. You never combine the two. if, let's, for example, you have a joint venture, the table must disclose only the portion attributable to your interest. So in other words, what you're not going to put in 100% if you only own or have rights to 50% of it. So you're going to have to make those adjustments. And then let's say, again, it goes to the reasonable price, point of reference. So that really comes down to, and these also have to be current as of the end of your most recently completed fiscal, and I missed the word year. So that was supposed to say recently completed fiscal year. So just pretend that it said that. So that's what really needs to go into the summary report. And you know, it tried to do so in a way that is most useful to the reader. All right, so now we're going to move on to the individual property disclosure. So this is for materiality, for a material property. And again, this is different than the 10%. So not every property that is, you know, greater than 10% is going to be required to be disclosed under the individual property disclosure. So again, you're going to consider the qualitative and quantitative factors when you consider the materiality of a property. So for each material property, right, this is going to be the description. This is just sort of the basic description before we start getting on to the tables of reserves and resources, et cetera. Is, you know, location, infrastructure, you know, the history and the development of it, the description of the title and rights. And so you can see how some of this is similar to what was in the summary disclosure, which is why the SEC was talking about allowing cross references. So the condition of the properties, past and planned work, stage of development, again, exploration, development, or production. You want to be very clear about that. And actually, while we're talking about that, if you are a company that has no reserves anywhere, even though you are extracting ore, you are still an exploration stage company. So you make sure that you don't identify yourself in a way that's different from the SEC allows you to identify yourself under the rules. So you just want to make sure that, you know, when you're looking at some of your general statements under business, how you're describing yourself, if you are not actually, you know, in production or in development, in other words, if you don't have reserves, you want to make sure that not just in these sections, but generally you're describing yourself in a way that's consistent. Again, you know, it's you want to sort of avoid sort of some of the SEC touch points. Cost or book value of property, plant, and equipment, any encumbrances, major permitting requirements, material exploration results. Again, this is only if they're material. You can always do it, but you're required if those are actually material. And then disclosure of an exploration target, which we talked about before, has to be separately captioned. And oddly enough, while this is in item 1304, the exploration target disclosure is contained in 1302. If I ran the world, I would have divided these rules up slightly differently, but unfortunately I do not. So exploration targets, because of the SEC's concerns, you don't have sufficient information here to be able to declare a resource yet. They want to make sure that they essentially highlight the fact that this is more speculative. And the way they do that is that you have to have exploration targets captured under a separate, it has to be under a separate caption. And you have to include this clear and prominent statement that, you know, any of the ranges that you're talking about where you think there's exploration potential here, that conceptual in nature, you know, you don't have mineral resources, you haven't had, there's insufficient exploration to establish it, that it may never result in a mineral resource being determined. And so it doesn't represent, and it shouldn't be construed to be an estimate of a mineral resource. So in other words, they really kind of really want to make sure that it's pounded home that this is highly speculative. And then but they want to make sure that you tell people why that you believe that there's a basis for this exploration target. Was there geological modeling that was done to kind of establish this as potentially an exploration target? What process was used? So in other words, if you want to talk about exploration targets, not only it has to be separately captioned, you have to put in these qualifying statements, and you have to put in quite a bit of detail that shows really, why you believe the statements that you're making under these sections, and why you believe it's an exploration target. And things should be expressed in terms of approximations and ranges to help make it very clear that this is highly speculative. Okay, so now we start getting into the tables. So one, the individual property disclosure, item 1304. Again, like the prior tables, you have to disclose the reasonable and justifiable price for each commodity, as well as the point of reference, which we've discussed. So again, you can modify the tables, you can add information, you can combine tables, but you cannot put reserves and resources in one table. So, and they also have to be exclusive of each other. Let's see, we received a question. So it says, do the mineral stage descriptions, exploration, development, or production, refer to the property or the company or both? A company may have an exploration stage project and a production stage project. Are the projects individually described as such, or are those terms apply to the company? So excellent question. And it applies to both. The same standard applies to both. So in other words, each property will be evaluated individually. But if you have a production stage company, a production stage project, as well as several exploration projects, you essentially are going to default to, you are a production stage company because you have a production stage property. So thank you very, very much for your question. Okay, let's see. Okay, here we go. Comparison. Oh, one point I want to note on the individual property disclosure, because keep in mind, these are all going to be based on your technical report summary. So these are all based on your TRS. One thing that you will note in item 1304, the SEC is not looking for a reiteration or a regurgitation of your technical report summary. It's going to be filed as an exhibit. They use the word brief when they talk about the individual property disclosure. Not only do they use the word brief, they use it 10 times. I know, I counted. So this is not a reiteration of the technical report summary. Do not assume that, well, we want to make sure we're thorough, so we're going to include 10 pages of geology in here because, well, it's cool. Now, I'm not saying it's not cool, but they really are looking for something that is more brief, something that is very much geared toward ease of investor disclosure. So again, now we're talking about the comparison. So you're going to compare your resources and reserves as of the end of your last fiscal year with the resources and reserves as of the preceding fiscal year and explain any material change. Material, again, is not defined. The SEC originally wanted to use 10% pretty much for everything, but that was not the case. But here's the thing. This is the first year that most people are under 1,300. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples and talk about how you would probably handle it. So let's say you only reported under Industry Guide 7 last year. You did not report under 43-101. So under Industry Guide 7, you had no resources because as far as the SEC was concerned, they didn't recognize them. And so there were no resources disclosed. And we're talking about in your annual report. We're not talking about what you may have put on your website. So there were no resources, and now you have resources under 1,300. What you would note is that, you previously, because you were under Industry Guide 7, you did not previously report resources. And so this is the first year in reporting resources. And then when you go to your reserves under Guide 7 and 1,300, there are very likely going to be some differences. They're very, very different rules. This one is, you know, the 1300 rules are much more precise, much more prescriptive. So I would expect that there would be some changes. And so here you'll be talking about, you know, you'll want to note that when you note the table with the differences, then you're going to talk about the explanation of any material change. So you'll talk about the net difference. And then, so for anything that causes the discrepancy, the first thing will probably be, we've changed the way we classify from Industry Guide 7 to 1300. And as such, it resulted in a significant change. And then you can also talk about the other things that go along. The question, when there was a question as to whether or not amount means tonnage. Typically, yes, amount would mean tonnage earlier on. My apologies. But it kind of depends on the, it would depend on the circumstance. But now let's talk about, let's say you reported under 43-101 last year. And you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm not allowed to put in 43-101 disclosure because that's no longer permitted. However, under this circumstance, because you did previously disclose resources under 43-101, and now you're going to be doing resources under 1300, and you can do that comparison, you will note the change. One thing that you should note, though, is make very clear disclosure that says, you know, the resources that were reported for fiscal year 2020 were prepared in accordance with 43-101 and permitted to be disclosed under Industry Guide 7. As a result, the resources may not be comparable to the resources that have been prepared under SK 1300. Now, realistically speaking, they're probably very close, but nonetheless, that's how you're going to do it. You do need to be very clear to disclose the fact that those prior resources were in accordance with 43-101 and they may not be comparable. That's kind of the one time when you can actually put in 43-101 information that has not been adapted to or confirmed to be also in accordance with 1300. So again, as we're going through, you're doing a comparison, explanation of any changes in any discrepancy. Again, it might include depletion, changes in prices, operating methods. You know, did you, you know, almost anything. Acquisitions or dispositions of properties and so on. And then there would be a question of whether or not you consider it to be this change to be material, both qualitative and quantitatively. I must admit, I have some reticence on having to describe something as material. You do not need to say that something is immaterial. So in other words, if you think that there is a material change, you can simply state that, but if you do not believe the change is material, technically speaking, you don't even need to describe the reasons for the difference. I expect whether or not someone considers it to be material, particularly this first year, the net changes will likely be described in any event. And then, as we said, you can describe this information can be presented in a narrative or tabular format, whatever makes the most sense and whatever you believe is clearest. Okay, so again, we're still on item 1304. So if the resources or reserves are being declared for the first time, or if material change is being disclosed, you are going to have to file a technical report summary as an exhibit. All right, so that's an exhibit, the technical report summary. Now remember, this is not part of your document. This is not incorporated into your document. I don't think it's prudent to incorporate it into your document as part of the disclosure. It is an exhibit. So if someone wants to go see it, they can easily go find it. So what you'll end up doing, though, is you do have to put in the material assumptions and criteria that were used in the technical report summary. So someone doesn't actually have to go looking for those, you know, and we would typically see these presented as, you know, a table that identifies, you know, any cutoff grades, pricing models, or otherwise used, as well as cross references to the TRS. So they know if someone wants to see, oh, it's section 13. So you're not incorporating section 13 into the document. It is simply helping someone understand if they want if they want to have a better understanding of the material assumptions, they know where in this long report they can go look. I was actually curious at one point. I was talking to the SEC about, I asked my son, so the TRS, the ones I've been looking at, they're essentially taking either the feasibility study or the pre-fees, et cetera, and that is actually the TRS. And he said, yeah, that's kind of what we're seeing too. It's not like it's a separate report. He says, but he said for certain kinds of projects or for certain types of things, he said, the actual pre-feasibility study or the feasibility study is, a few thousand pages long, in which case the TRS is actually a summary of a longer report. And so in case you're wondering if your company's doing it like everybody else, it's done both ways, but in many instances, the TRS and the pre-fees, the fees, et cetera, the feasibility study, they're the exact same thing. All right, so one other thing I want to discuss with you is that, so all of the information and all of the assumptions pertaining to the disclosure of resources and reserves have to be current as of the end of your most recent fiscal year, okay? So if you're relying on a previously prepared report, so let's say you were buying a property and you wanted to get a 1300 report, completed before you actually acquired it. So let's say that was prepared in August. So what you would end up doing is that you would make sure that before you would end up looking at it to ensure that the information in there between August and December remains current. There's not been a material change in the information. All right. So now let's talk about exploration activity and results. You are not required to discuss exploration results unless it's material to an investment decision. And if that's the case, yes, you actually do need to discuss it. But if you are disclosing exploration activity for a material property, because again, this is part of the individual property disclosure, you need to provide a summary, for each sampling method used, talk about the number of samples, length of the samples, total number of assays, et cetera. So you do need to provide a certain level of detail in here if you want to talk about your exploration activity. And then if you're going to be talking about the results for a material property, you identify the hole, trench, or other sample that generated the results. You try to put a brief discussion of the exploration results and try to put them in context and give them context and relevance. So again, you do not need to discuss exploration activity or exploration results unless they are material to investors. And again, materiality goes to the issue of whether a reasonable investor would consider this to be relevant when they're choosing to make an investment decision. If that is the case, then you do need to include this information. Yeah, so in other words, your choice is taken away from you. All right, so internal controls. I can almost hear the collective groan regarding internal controls. Now, you all have internal controls in your documents already when you're dealing with the internal controls that SOX requires for, so the internal control over financial reporting. This disclosure is not like that disclosure, because that disclosure says, yes, we're responsible for preparing it, we've done an evaluation, the yada yadas, right? But it doesn't actually talk about it very much. It just says that you're responsible for preparing it and that you've done it under COSO. But this is different. This type of internal control, assuming that you have internal controls, you need the description. So your quality control and your quality assurance programs, the verification of your analytic procedures, the risk inherent in these estimates. In other words, what procedures are you taking to ensure that the information that you're providing has gone through quality control procedures? What is your oversight? So in other words, if you've decided that you just want to hire your deadbeat brother to do this so you can write him a check and write it off as a company expense, that's going to be harder to deal with when you're dealing with your issuer's internal controls. So now keep in mind, oil and gas companies have been having to do this disclosure for some time. So if you're looking at a variety, if you're trying to find some samples, I suggest you look at the reserve governance discussions that oil and gas companies have been putting into place. And many times they'll talk about, who's responsible for oversight, if they have different committees, et cetera. And so that might be a good place to look. If in fact you're in a very early stage, you're about to start exploration activities, you don't yet have, like very long established controls. What it may be is simply stating that, we have not yet established our controls, but we anticipate that, prior to beginning our exploration activities, we will do, X, Y, and Z, which will be, establishing how data is maintained, et cetera. So you'll be able to find some difference. They're not looking for step-by-step procedures here. This is a discussion of the higher level controls, but you cannot simply state that you have them. There has to be a discussion of them. So in that way, it differs from your SOX internal controls. All right, QP info. So your qualified persons, now keep in mind, when it comes to being a qualified person, as the issuer, you are required to know, and it is your job to ensure that they are in fact a qualified person. We're going to be talking about kind of what qualifies as a qualified person, but it is the issuer's job to ensure that the qualified person meets those requirements. All right, so what information actually has to be in the document? So let's say, before we go on to this, there was a very good and relevant question talking about material assumptions and so on, and will you be required to issue pre-fees or fees each year? No, we're going to be discussing that in a few minutes when we talk about some of the issues with respect to the SEC, because that was a question that we posted to them. All right, so, but going back to the QP info. So let's say you have two reports, two TRSs that you're going to be filing. One is prepared by your employees. So effectively the issuers made it using employees, and the employees have to satisfy the QP qualifications again. And then one is made by an outside party. So you could simply state that the technical report summary and the reserve and calculations were prepared by employees of the registrant. Full stop. You don't actually have to name them. You can just say, our employees prepared it. Done. With respect to a third party, so, because keep in mind, an entity, has a lot of the employees, but again, the individuals who are preparing this report have to be QPs. So when you have a third party, you can simply indicate that they're not employees, that they are actually, employees of, name your engineering firm. And whether or not that engineering firm is affiliated with a registrant. So if they are affiliated and so on, now remember, your QPs don't have to be independent. But the point of this is to make sure that the reader and the investor knows, like, okay, was this a third party that, they're being paid to prepare this report, but is it a third party that's doing it, or is it the company itself? Just so you get a better sense of, so the reader understands, who's the one who's responsible for this, and, was there a third party involved? Again, it's not required. This really just goes to informing the investor who prepared these reports. Okay, so the QP is going to need to sign a consent before a technical report summary is filed. So I'm going to clarify for you when you actually have to file the consent, because it's not very clearly written. So if you read it literally, you might get this wrong. So you're going to file the consent if the report is used in an SEC registration statement, or if it's being used in a report that's incorporated into a registration statement. So in other words, let's say we're talking about your 10K. Your 10K, you have an outstanding shelf on a Form S3. Your 10K is incorporated into that. That's what keeps it current. Because it's being incorporated into an SEC registration statement, the QP consent will need to be not only received, but filed. So even though the rules say, gee, if it's with an Exchange Act report, you need to get it, but you can just throw it in your filing cabinet. That's not the case when it's incorporated into an SEC registration statement. If your 10K is incorporated, just assume that if you're getting a QP consent and those QPs are named, you will have to actually file the consent. If the QP is not an employee of the issuer, as we were discussing on the previous page, it is okay to attribute the report to the QP's firm and you don't have to name the individual. Then the firm signs the consent. They sign the report and they sign the consent. All right, so I think we're actually going to move past this on and go to, if you really feel like punishing yourself, you can go through and read more about technical report summaries. But I want to talk about QP standards because that is part of what you do have to do. And then we're going to go through some of our conversations with staff. All right, QP standards. And for those of you who are subject to 43-101, these are not identical. So here's the question. Well, someone said, if the QP does not need to be independent for SEC reporting, does that conflict with 43-101 purposes? Yes, in fact, it does. So if you are actually subject to both 43-101 and the new SEC rules, you are going to need to actually comply with the most conservative of the two. So in other words, if you are required to have independent QPs do your reports under 43-101, you will have to have independent QPs. You will be using independent QPs, which is perfectly permissible under 1300. But the converse, unless there was going to be guidance under 43-101, the converse would not be true. And so you couldn't use individuals if you were required to use independent QPs under 43-101. So when it comes to disclosure and when it comes to reports, because most companies I know, if they are going to have 43-101 and 1300 reports, they're going to try to have it be the same report. And so you're going to end up deferring to the most conservative of the two so that you comply with both. All right, QP standards. 5 years of experience in this type of mineralization deposit, member in good standing of a recognized professional organization. The SEC is not putting out a list. And so, there's the list of what the organization, needs to be. I want to move on to some disclosure questions that we were talking about with the SEC. So keep in mind, there is QP liability. So with respect to people who are employees or otherwise, when it comes to third parties, we're seeing more onerous indemnification obligations on the part of the issuer. At one point, we were told that some of the insurers for some of the QPs would not insure them for any reports they did that were going to be subject to the 1300 report. Now, keep in mind, none of the liabilities ever changed, but the SEC actually decided to tell everybody how much liability there was. So if you're dealing with a third party, expect, if you have not already seen them, more onerous and lengthy indemnification agreements. We're just seeing that more and more. All right. This is more about preparing for implementation. So if you're not yet subject to the new rules, we are working with a number of clients who won't be subject, for several months yet, and they're still working on it. And so we're talking about if you're updating or preparing a prior technical report and so on, first thing to do is call your engineers and figure out if it complies with both. And so in many instances, it is very, very close and can typically be updated relatively easily. Okay, conversations with the staff. So I've been having a good time with the staff on this lately. One, the guys in the mining group are fabulous. George Schuler and John Coleman are very, very, very nice people, very practical, and they they actually answer their phones and are happy to work through these rules because they understand that people are trying to They're trying to get it right. And, you know, for the first year, they know people are going to have a number of questions. So at one point when we were going through the concept of the QP consents, I was chatting with the SEC and I said, okay, so I have to file a QP consent. So QP is named. Can I just get it at the time the report is received? And just, so if the report's received and the report is done, let's say January 10th, I'm not filing until the end of March. Can I just get their consent and have it filed with the 10K, as long as it gives me permission to be able to use their information, et cetera, in the 10K, and then appropriately file it? And he was like, well, yeah. He says, I can't imagine QP would sign it. And I'm like, yeah, okay, yeah. Theoretically, you know, you could get a report, and as long as it's written broadly enough, you could continue to use it. Again, I agree. I can't imagine a QP would sign a consent like that. And they might get a little irritated if they discover that you're using their consent several months later. Okay, so MJDS issuers. We were talking before that MJDS issuers are not subject to 1300. Okay, so here's the rub. If your stock price drops too low, more than 60 days before filing your annual report, you're not allowed to use that report. You have to use a Form 20-F. Form 20-F is subject to 1300. So at that point, you may not have time to convert your 43-101 reports into 1300 reports. So in other words, if your stock price is kind of hovering, you're never sure, you may want to prepare for this eventuality. So you cannot reference a 43-101 report if they are not compliant with 1300. Now, keep in mind, if they're compliant with both, you can reference both, that it's been prepared in accordance with 43-101 and SK 1300. But if it doesn't comply with 1300, you can't reference it, full stop. Which means that you wouldn't be able to reference any of your reserves or your resources because you wouldn't have a compliant report. All right, so producing company. Now we're going to get on to the question that was answered. So you have a producing company. They get a report from December 31, 2021 that identifies reserves. Rufus prepares a report. And by the way, my dog's name is Rufus, and that's where we got that. So Rufus prepares and he gives them a consent regarding the use of the information. And then over the next year, the issuer is extracting ore. So it's a producing mine. And so when they have reserves, they can actually call themselves a producing mine. And so then at the end of next year, Jane, she's a company employee. She's also a QP. So she qualifies as a QP, very important. She updates the reserve numbers to reflect the amount of ore that's been extracted. So this reduces the reserves. So let's say nothing else happens. It just reduces the reserves. So since she did that update, she's going to be, providing a consent to the issuer. So, however, her estimates were based on Rufus's report. So does Rufus need to provide a new consent? Well, no, you don't need a new TRS simply for production unless there's a material change. So, you might want to make sure you have an updated report for producing mine, which is particularly critical in the last few years of a mine life. For an annual report, for annual production, you just use the reconciliation. Remember, we're talking about the changes from prior year. That's where you would describe it, changes from the old report. You could also just note that when there's an update to an existing report, you can reflect that the updated numbers were from a prior technical report and updated to reflect depletion. You could simply reference to, the prior technical report without actually naming it, and then you don't necessarily need to get the consent. Frankly, it was just, it's one of those things where it kind of depends on how many consents you want to chase. Chasing consents, QP herding, it can be a challenge when you're trying to file. So, someone asked how much is too low for being able to use a 40F at 75 million US. Okay, so other conversations with the staff. So we already sort of touched on this briefly. When you actually end up having, so if you want to convert an existing report to a 1300 report. So the reason that the SEC used a standard date at the end of your fiscal year, they deliberately determined this because they wanted to have a standard date for reporting reserves because they felt it made things more comparable when you have reserves of different properties. So your technical report can be effective, let's say in August, and then you simply have an internal person doing the update. And if it's in production, be sure you reference depletion. Okay, so when we're talking about how long a technical report summary lasts, like, is there an actual time limit? And I have 4 minutes, so we'll see what I can get through. Is there actually a time limit how long you can use it? So if you believe there have been no material changes, for example, it's an exploration property, you're going through permitting, but you don't either have new drilling, it's not in production, et cetera. I mean, you know, you're almost sort of at a static stage and there haven't been massive changes in pricing, then you can use it, you know, then you can use that technical report for a while. So the average, okay, based on, like I said, this is conversations with the SEC staff. This is not the rule. Their expectation was that a shelf life for TRS would probably be 3 to 5 years. But it was never the intent of the SEC to have a TRS updated every year. Now, it could be that there could be times where you actually have a TRS one year and significant changes occur, such that there are very much material changes where you might need a TRS. But that was really never the intent. All right, and then this was something that was brought up with respect to many of the commentary with respect to the rules, which is some issuers are concerned about having to publicly report publicly operating cost for specific plants because they haven't had to do it before. So it could be that you have if you have multiple operations feeding one plant, you can use common cost for processing. So you could essentially aggregate and average those costs. So there's different ways to look at things, but the SEC, while they weren't sympathetic to it at all, they just felt it was material information that needed to be disclosed. So we only have 2 more minutes. I just want you to know there are some things here at the end talking about some of the key differences with 43-101. In case you are subject to those and what to see them. It covers things like some of the differences with respect to qualified persons and between the rules, because there are a number of issuers who are actually subject to both. And so that's it. So that is, I am happy to stay on and answer any questions. If you have any questions at all, I'll stay on for another couple of minutes in case there is anything. And there's a question about the copy of the slides on, I think it's, hold on. It's on events@dorsey.com, so that you can download those from the reminder email that came from events@dorsey.com. So the materials were there. And so I thank you very much for spending time with us today. I hope this helped answer some of the questions, and good luck. We are delighted to answer any questions that you have, and have a very, very nice day. Take care.